What I'd like to do now, we've had inspiring and provocative examples and remarks from these speakers, and I'd love to give them a chance to do something that they probably rarely do, which is ask questions and exchange ideas with each other. I think we'd benefit a lot from that. So I'm just going to open it up to you guys to maybe, share some ideas or ask questions of each other in whatever way you want to. Any thoughts? Let me give you this.
I have a question for Steve, actually.
Damn, I was going to ask.
I stole his mic.
So actually, both Will and Steve talked about metrics. How can we measure, what matters? And that's something that I have not done, but I really appreciate. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that one city. Was it Charleston? Charlotte, that was measuring, because I think that is such a cool idea, to actually measure the ways in which we're building a more sustainable local economy. And I was just wondering, what are some of those ways? And did each household measure? I mean, did you measure how much electricity a household used or a community used, or what did you do specifically? What did you do? Because I'm just very curious about that.
It's a great question, and I know we're going to be Lou Daly. I see him sitting patiently in the audience. Is going to be, I think, making a presentation about the GPI. Is that later today, Lou, or tomorrow?
Oh, okay. Well,
but in terms of, but it's a really good point you're making. There's a lot of interesting work like that going on at the community scale, like the example I gave from Charlotte. But there are many, many. Seattle. I mean, part of the problem actually is that. There isn't a standard way. And one thing that's in motion now, it'll be interesting to see whether this succeeds, is there's now a national effort called the Star Communities Index that is an attempt to create a standard way of gauging sustainable communities, or in this parlance, new communities across the economic, environmental, and social spectrums. It's actually born out of a frustration that a lot of local practitioners, myself included when I was in that role, have had over the years, that there is no consistent way, and that cities and communities are frequently judged externally by the Green Cities Index or these third-party comparisons of cities that use questionable data and that don't tend not to consult closely with the communities when they're building their system. So it was born out of that frustration. That would be, I think, if it succeeds, the standard bearer in terms of which metrics communities could use, and they're working on a web-based platform that would make that more consistent as well. But there's a lot of interesting work going on along those lines, and I think Charlotte is one of the better examples that I know of. That's why I put it forward. I'm going to return the favor then, and this is actually both for Judy and Will. I am always so inspired to hear these very personal stories about decisions that you made in terms of how you spend your life energy and all the progress that you've been able to, all the change you've been able to create because of those decisions that you made. And so in particular, Judy, at least two inflection points that you mentioned, where you had the epiphany around using factory farmed pigs and cattle toward a more sustainably raised. And I think you mentioned that it was reading a book that was the trigger. And then you also had the epiphany around whether you should kind of hoard that competitive edge or share that and become a force for accelerating the adoption of those practices by others. So I'd love to hear more, and of course, Will's example as well. I'd love to hear more from both of you. What happened at those inflection points? What's a little bit more on, and how do we? I mean, those of us. I mean, ultimately, we need every entrepreneur to have that epiphany, right? Or at least a critical mass of them. But we don't, and so far from it, right? So short of a massive cloning exercise. To reproduce the Judy Wicks and the Will Raaps of the world. What are some of your, what's a little more insight on those inflection points for you both, and then what you think we can do as nonprofit organizations to try to get more of that, kind of values-based entrepreneurship going in our regions?
Well, I don't, I didn't, when I made that decision to share, it wasn't because I was thinking, well, cooperating and sharing is the right thing to do, and I'm going to do that now. I did it because I love the pigs. And, you know, because people have asked me this question before, and I had to think about it, and that was what motivated me, because I love the pigs, and I love the environment that was being polluted, and I love the small-scale farmers, you know, I love community. All the things that I loved were being attacked by this system. And so it was kind of like the mother bear, you know, roaring. It was about protecting what I love, which is in that quote of mine that Will read. And I think and that's why I wanted to end with this idea about bringing forth the Gladys in each of us, in a sense, our feminine qualities, is that we've been trained as business people to suck it up and make decisions not based on our feelings. That's kind of sissy stuff, you know, to make decisions based on feelings, that we need to make decisions based on an analytical mind. You know, how much profit is this decision going to make? And we've buried our heart and our feelings, you know. So I really feel that the key, you know, to this movement, and as I mentioned before, it's not just the entrepreneurs, but the consumers and the investors, you know, that we have to really think about how is our dollar affecting. When we spend $1, how does it affect, or invest $1 for that matter? And I didn't talk about investing. That's a really important part of this movement too, is making sure our money's invested in our local economies and not in the stock market. Because a lot of people working on local economies still have their money in the stock market. And that's not doing any good. That's perpetuating the old system. So when we invest $1, spend $1, we need to think, how's this dollar affecting other people? And how's it affecting other animals? And how's it affecting nature? How's it affecting my children's future? How's it affecting all that I love? And be mindful and make decisions from the heart, not just from the head.
So, I said I came to Vermont because I was looking for a place that had access to common sense as it relates to the way the world really seems to work. If you're in a place without that, it's very hard to be successful. Someone like Judy sort of made it up as you went along, but you kept getting positive feedback, right? You kept, and you created community around you that validated you were on the right track, as opposed to what this idea of moving toward a more sustainable world can often do, which is have the feedback loops be of the conventional system that doesn't support what your goals are. So one of the real things in Vermont is we have the highest per capita percentage of independently owned businesses. That builds a strength from the outset, which is people who are rooted in having the most sustainable, resilient, equitable place to live that they can, because that's where they are, and they have impact on that. We didn't really get affected by the mortgage financial collapse because we had mostly local banks lending in Vermont to people, you know, in a way that didn't get out of balance with people's ability to pay for their mortgages. There was a sense of feedback loops that were available and important to the values we were holding on to as key and we wanted to choose. An inflection point for me, Steve, to your point, I wish I was more feminine and was totally motivated by love and compassion and stuff, but I tend to be more masculine and thinking often, but that's not bad. I mean, there's a role for that too, because the inflection point for me was this work that happened 15 years ago where Bob Costanza and others valued our natural economy, our valued nature, which is sort of a yucky thing to have to try and figure out to do. But those pigs were a product of no valuing of nature. So if we inculcated the idea that all living things, all of our environment has value, and we actually begin to quantify that value or quantify the loss when we lose that value, There's something important there's a new feedback loop that's important there. And that feedback loop for me was the recognition that, that trees produce oxygen, that bees pollinate, that wetlands clean water, and all those things have value, but we've totally discounted that value. And if we discount that value, we don't know that we're losing something critical and important. We can go out and walk among those trees in that forest or in that wetland and have a good feeling, but we don't see the diminishing of that over time. If we have some kind of a mechanism to understand the diminishing of that, that would be important. And then as it relates to an underlying theme, I think we're going to hear again and again here, that of climate change. A lot of the solutions to climate change are going to be getting those emissions, right, out of the atmosphere, stopping the addition of new emissions into the atmosphere. But the other aha I got in recent years, 4 or 5 years ago, was that if we want to restore our forests and our wetlands and our prairies, we can do that by letting nature do it by photosynthesizing the carbon out of the atmosphere and sucking it into a productive application. And every time I have the opportunity to say something to people about climate change, I say, don't forget about nature's ability to solve the problem for us by sequestering carbon, excess carbon in the atmosphere. So if we do both of those things, and guess what? When we're doing that, we're also likely producing healthier wetlands and forests and soils and prairies. So then you get this feedback loop of good stuff happening. But it is important to measure it, I think, because we're like the frog in the cold pan of water that gets put on boil and doesn't know it's dead until it's dead, because it can't understand the temperature change. We don't see the degradation of society and community and ecosystem that's happening. So that's why measuring what matters, I think, is really important. The broad idea of GDP has it all wrong and is hurtful needs to be put out there, but the other idea of what can be helpful needs to be put out there. If that answers your question?
Yes, excellent. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one more little thing to that, because when you were talking about nature, and in terms of my own motivation, and it's my understanding that I'm a part of nature, that man is a part of nature, and just the spiritual idea that we're all interconnected. Therefore we have empathy. When I feel like I'm spiritually connected to the pigs and the trees and the all of life. So I see myself in the pig. I see myself, in the polluted waters or whatever. And I think that this, I think it was Stephen earlier today that mentioned that there's two worldviews, and I see those two worldviews as being one of that we're all interconnected, and the other worldview is that we're separate. I think that more and more people are starting to see that we all are interconnected with each other and with nature, and our own lives depend on that interconnection with a healthy environment.
You are a product, though, of going and living with Eskimos for a year, and,
right.
and having, we all can't have that incredible sense of unity. That comes from your upbringing. Mm-hmm. We have to have a framework that begins to tell us we got it wrong. Mm. So then we can say, well, what is right then? Mm-hmm. So I'm worried if the idea of bringing compassion into our decision making is going to rely on essentially the whole view that you have created in your life. Mm. How do we have the predominant systems in our life, our government, our economy, begin to give us those things so we can go, oh, I choose mm-hmm. life.
Right.
I
think that's the other part. We're talking about the balancing the masculine and the feminine. Yeah. We got that nurturing, but we also have to have the analytical mind. Yeah. Measure, just as you're saying. You're the perfect example of that, of figuring things out, and the logic and the rationale. We need to teach that in our schools and have our government policies be guided by the proof that we all know what is true and can measure.
That's
Great interchange. I'm going to now take the last few minutes and open it up to questions from the floor. Anybody want to start? Paul?
Thank all the panelists. I really appreciate your observations. But I want to go back, Will, to something that you threw out there kind of in passing. It's a metric on the percentage of calories produced locally then versus now. I'm not exactly sure. I caught when then was. I know where now is, but I wasn't sure. But I mean, to me, this is. I'm always looking for a call to arms that resonates, and it seems to me this is a call to arms that would resonate very well just about anywhere you go, and I'm thinking about all the different arguments for that. You mentioned an economic argument, but I bet you there are a lot of other arguments that I can't even think of, and I'm just wondering who has the access or who has thought through some of those arguments of why it's so critical for us to start reversing that trend of calories produced locally versus calories imported from who knows where.
Yeah. Well, Joan is probably going to give us some insights on that in her talk. What I've discovered is, first of all, we're part of a global food system. So if you say, let's just do Burlington, Vermont, or Charleston, South Carolina, you're going to fail. You have to recognize that you're part of a much larger system, but it's not the whole world. You don't have to worry about the whole world. It's some kind of a regional system. So figure out the logic of that regional system. What we discovered in Vermont was our regional system was Vermont plus 30 miles outside of Vermont, partly because we looked at what a level of sustainable production and consumption would be to achieve a certain outcome, and we needed to include a little of Massachusetts and a little of New York because that got us some grains and some other things into the conversation. But the idea of a food shed is now what's being reflected. And there's a new book out. Anyone know the name of it? Creating the Local Food Shed or something like that? Huh? Rebuilding the Local Food Shed. Really good. And it provides a lot of this sort of framing of why it's important, why it makes sense. And there's a professor out of Tufts who has done an analysis of the New England food shed. So we're talking about Vermont and a little bit more. There's also a New England food shed that makes sense. That gets us into shellfish and fishing and a little in a little broader reflection. So it really, as Steve was saying, it really is about economic development that we're talking here, and rebuilding the food shed or rebuilding our food system is a great driver for a larger question about successful, sustainable economic development. Whether it's this rebuilding the food shed or this professor from Tufts, they're doing a good job of quantifying impact on energy, quantifying impact on job creation, quantifying the multiplier effect when you buy food that was produced locally in terms of keeping that dollar flowing in the local economy. So, yeah, that's sort of the analytical frame that makes it.
We're a good pair that way.
I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. Well, I don't want Walmart or Kroger's or anyone else like that to tell me what my strategy is about my food, where my food comes from. What I want is, I want this collaborative process that we're talking about. The industrial food system has got problems. We need to rebuild the local food system. We need to do that in a stakeholder collaborative process that engages all the folks. And I think when I started out the work in the Intervale in Burlington, we did analysis that says 0.2% of the food in Burlington came from Burlington. And we said, okay, let's set a goal, 10%. We did a little bit of analysis to say 10% is possible, and we're at 8% right now. So we're making progress towards that. I think that same sort of a goal begins to encourage questioning and quantification of what's possible. So I do encourage that sort of measuring and within within a framework of what is logical given your resources as a good benchmark.
Great. Question?
Good afternoon. Glad to see all on the chilling the other day. I'm Queen Quet. I'm the chiefess and head of state for the Gullah Geechee Nation. I really believe in divine order because I just flew in from D.C. from an event with Toyota and Audubon Together Green Fellows where we graduated yesterday talking about the same things you're talking about today. So I thank Dana Beach and the Coastal Conservation League for inviting me to run up here after getting in at midnight last night. But I wanted to find out, I couldn't clearly understand, did you say the STAR Community Index? STAR Community Index? Within that index and within that measuring system, is cultural continuation and traditional knowledge a factor within it? I'm a mathematician, so I'm trying to understand what those dynamics are, and I intend to look it up. But do you know whether or not that is a factor that is within that measurement system?
I don't. I know they have cultural factors, but whether that specific one is the way it's framed, I don't know. So I would encourage you to go to their website, Star Communities Index.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you all for being here. Wonderful talk today and great ideas. My name's John Peters. I teach at the College of Charleston here and have a big interest in obviously educating our students and using that knowledge to inform their values, their life choices, and those sorts of things. We've been throwing around this idea of sustainability a lot, that word, perhaps maybe too much at some level. But I would absolutely agree that where our calories come from geographically matters, but all calories are not equal. I think we can all agree that as societies continue to develop, as wealth increases in people's lives, people eat more meat. How can we resolve this idea of sustainability given that a calorie that comes from a pig uses 10 times more land, perhaps hundreds, even thousands of times more water, if you include the water that was required to grow the food for that animal and the water that's involved in the slaughtering process, et cetera, et cetera. How can we resolve this if we talk about sustainability in the context of local communities that are still growing a lot of animals for food?
I think you're totally right there. I totally agree that we need to eat a lot less meat. And unfortunately, the U.S. is a model for developing countries like India and China who want to eat more meat because they see it, that's a measure of wealth and success. And I think it's up to the United States to start reversing that trend and having all of us eat less meat and have meat be seen as something that we do in a celebration. I tend to eat red meat maybe once a month at the most, and it's always for something special occasion, and even chicken I only have once a week, so I think it's really important that we, for many reasons, but particularly environmental, eat a lot less meat, because I don't think there's any answer to your question other than that. It's true that it uses many more calories to raise meat than if we ate the food that we feed to the animals instead. And there's just, I do see an increase in that. Especially among younger people, more and more vegetarians and vegans, and some really great restaurants. We have a new one in Philadelphia called Veg, that it's all vegetarian food, and it is fabulous. It's my favorite restaurant in all Philadelphia. It used to be thought of as that's kind of a marginal hippie kind of place, we go to a vegetarian restaurant. But now there's incredible upscale vegetarian restaurants, and I think it's our future. We need to do that, and it's delicious and fun, so why not?
So I actually disagree.
Okay.
I was a vegetarian in my 20s and felt pretty righteous about that, and also sick, until someone said I have type O blood and I'm supposed to eat meat. So I went, fantastic, I get to eat meat again. I do think we've totally overdone it. If you do the analysis of where most meat calories come, the energy input and energy output from the meat industry, it's silly. But there's also a role that, that humanity has grown up with, where meat is part of our food system. And what I've discovered is it can be an important part of creating, sorry to use the word, a sustainable food system. By that, really, so pastured poultry. I operate a small vegetable farm in Vermont and another one in Costa Rica. And pastured poultry is an important part of our fertility regime and our insect control regime. And these are not unhappy birds. They're probably unhappy that we eat them, if they have that feeling. And now we're seeing that with cattle, you can actually have a pretty interesting restorative production system with cattle in certain kinds of in certain kinds of grasslands and soil conditions, where it helps you create a much more durable, productive system. We should not overeat, but I do think we should look at an agriculture, a local agriculture, that brings fertility into it, with animals as part of the solution to that fertility.
I just want to clarify that I agree with you, that I'm not saying don't eat any meat. I'm just saying we need to eat a lot less. A lot of people eat meat 3 times a day. I mean, I think it'd be better if we ate it 3 times a week. But I think the integrated animal, vegetable farms are really important. That's where the fertilizer comes from. So I agree with that part.
I think that's a great preview of the panel on the new food chain that's going to be coming up later on this afternoon. And I think that's all we have time for. Would y'all please join me in thanking our distinguished panel?